former head of the Department of Genetics and Environment at UCL, who's won awards for his writing, talking about the Joy of Sect, rewriting the Bible as a scientific textbook. Steve Jones.
Thank you.
Before I forget for the second time in a row, we are filming this talk, so if anyone doesn't want to be filmed, then you might want to go to the back corner, and when we do questions afterwards, just ask the edit out.
Also, we're very highly privileged to be receiving this talk today as Justin did us last night. So we were the first guinea pigs for this to be tried out on, so without much further ado, I guess you see James.
Okay, I struggle with the... Can you see that okay? Yeah. Okay, this talk is called The Joy of Sects. It's a difficult word, sects, in many senses. It's S-E-C-T-S rather than S-E-X, but as we'll see, sects and sects actually have quite a lot to do with each other. When I was a student in Edinburgh, some years ago, I have to say, in a niche on the main staircase in the zoology department, there's a little bronze statue about that big of a chimpanzee, and there's a copy of it. There it is. Okay, and you'll see that the animal is sitting on a pile of books, one of which is by Darwin, and he's looking at an open page. Well, there is an open page, looking at a human skull, and on an open page of another book are the mythic words "Eritis sicut Deus." Now, unlike all Oxford undergraduates, who all speak, of course, fluent Latin and Greek, I'm sure, myself as a mere Edinburgh student was only just able to speak fluent English at that time, so I didn't know what it meant. And I wasn't particularly curious about it. But years later, I thought to myself, what the hell does that mean? So I looked it up, and it turned out to mean that what it is, it's a quotation from the third chapter of the book of Genesis. And what it means, what it is a statement of what the serpent said to Eve when she ate the forbidden fruit. In the Latin translation of St. Jerome, in the 4th century, it reads, Eritis sicut Deus scientes bonum et malum. And then ye shall be like gods, knowing of good and evil. Okay, in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened. So that's what the serpent in the Garden of Eden tempted Eve with, knowledge of good and evil. The Latin for knowledge is, of course, scientia, from which the name science actually derives. Well, I don't think that science can tell you much about good and evil, because they're not particularly scientific concepts. But it struck me when I was thinking about that actually the Old Testament in particular, but most religious texts, including the Quran, are just like scientific textbooks in the it's actually quite, it asks some very interesting questions. It asks about the origin of the universe, about the origin of the earth, the origin of life, of humans, the origin of sex, the meaning of guilt, the historical events to do with great floods and the like. And the penny kind of dropped. I thought, well, actually, this narrative, which is actually a damn good read in the King James Version, is actually an attempt to write a scientific textbook. Why don't I update it for the modern world? Ask the same questions, but give not the mythical answers which were given in 3,000 years BC when it began to be written, but the answers which we believe we know today. And I've done that. My book is actually called The Serpent's Promise. It's an attempt to update the Bible, to rewrite the Bible. I often say to my undergraduate students, I warn them with terrible portentousness in my voice of the dangers of plagiarism, but I myself am a serial plagiarist, because as a few of you might know, I've attempted to update and rewrite the works of Charles Darwin, and I've done them all in the end. So I have never had an original idea in my life, and this is not an original idea. All the ideas come from thousands of years ago, but some of the evidence is pretty new. Well, I don't know, it hasn't been published yet. It's published in May. Excellent. Have you got a birthday in May? Excellent birthday present, I would say. I don't know whether it will succeed. As I said to my publishers, I don't mind if the religious fundamentalists burn this book, because it's blasphemous, as long as they buy it first. But I shall wait and see whether that actually succeeds. Hang on, what's going on here? This man is about to set fire to my... All right, that's okay. Okay, so and it turned out it was actually really good fun to write. It took a long time, but it covers all kinds of topics, many of which are a bit obvious. The Great Flood, which almost certainly has something to do with the enormous floods which have happened over time, possibly in the end of the last ice age. That's a bit obvious. Some of them a bit less obvious. If you look at the book of Leviticus, it's full of terrible threats to people who catch diseases, leprosy. It's not clear it was the same disease as modern leprosy, but in the days of Leviticus, written about 1500, 2000 BC, these were the days of the first cities. Okay, Babylon, indeed, was the first big city in the world, and Leviticus says people shall hiss at Babylon because of its infections and diseases. And of course, as we all know, infectious disease needs big populations to get moving. And the ancient scribes noticed that and ascribed it, of course, the infections to the sins of the inhabitants of Babylon rather than to bacteria, which of course they were due to. And there are many more. There's rather interesting stuff about the nature of many biblical visions of the prophets, some of whom were clearly had mental disorders of different kinds, and you can identify them quite clearly. But what I've chosen to talk about today is really the unifying theme of the Bible, which is its deep concern about purity, impurity, sex, age, and death. Okay, I'll try and squeeze that all into the next 45 minutes, which isn't necessarily going to work. I should say it's the first time I've given this lecture, so I hope it works out. All right. So here we have a statement of the Bible's concern about sex, because of course, eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil gave rise to the first and possibly the least original of all sins, which was sex itself. Eve was cloned from Adam, and at least one of the versions given in Genesis. And these wonderful William Blake drawings show Satan, the devil, watching the endearments of Adam and Eve. Sex is not a good thing. And once one had sex, the purity of Eden was lost. It might be regained, if you're a Christian in the New Testament, after death, when you go back to a sexless heaven. But because you have sex, we're marked with sin, with original sin. And everybody is born imperfect as a result. Now, the question about what to do about original sin, the idea that we're all imperfect and will be judged at the end of time, split the church, the Christian church, from its very beginning. And it remains split to the present day. And some of the splits have a surprisingly modern air. Now, the purists among Christians, felt that we were all doomed and damned before birth. God knew who was going to be saved and who wasn't going to be saved, and nothing you could do would change your fate of going to heaven, like John Calvin and a few other extreme Protestants, or burning in hell like all the rest of us. By the decree of God, for the manifestation of his glory, some men and angels are predestinated unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. And the star says it's in the genes. Okay? That's basically a genetic statement. You have got this genetic fate, you were born with it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Okay? And many people believe that. Many people still do believe that. There is an opposing view, a rather earlier one. This is Pelagius, the 4th century philosopher, who got into terrible trouble with the church because he felt, okay, you were marked by original sin because of Adam and Eve and the terrible sexual practices, but in fact, as long as you behaved well, you would be forgiven that and you would go to heaven. Obedience results from the decision of the mind, not the substance of the body. So if you had pure thoughts, however imperfect you were physically, you would be saved. So we give him a little star, and he's an environmentalist, okay? He's a nurture man rather than a nature man. And of course, that view is very much around us today. Many people believe that many human attributes like intelligence or criminality or happiness or depression are actually everything to do with the way you live, the thoughts you have, rather than what you're born with. And there's a third theme, which actually is rather perhaps slightly closer to the scientific truth, which comes from this chap here, who's St. Augustine of Hippo, who was very important in the early church. And he said, original sin is whereby they are made captive under the devil's power, so they're marked with going to burn in hell until they are redeemed therefrom by the blood of Christ. And his little star says, it's in the genes because you're marked by the devil's power, but choose the right environment, in other words, join the Catholic Church, and you'll be perfectly okay. All right? So you'll be damned, but you can change your environment and be saved. So we're really asking some pretty genetical kinds of questions here. Now, those ideas are still very much around us, and there's almost an obsession in the public mind, and indeed in the mind of many geneticists, to take a genetic interpretation of all human attributes, from human height to human happiness. We can trace that absolutely to the chap who founded, in some senses, founded human genetics in his 1863 book, was it? Hereditary Genius. It's not Galton, it's Galton. I only did this afternoon. Francis Galton was convinced of the fact that genius ran in families. Crime also ran in families. And Galton was absolutely concerned with human qualities. And he did a number of very remarkable things. He's the only person, as far as we know, for example, to make a beauty map of the British Isles. And we still have the little brass counting device which he used to walk around British cities and hold in his hand and score the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. The low point was in Aberdeen, where I once went to Aberdeen, and where I rather foolishly said where it still is, and I had to make a quick run out of the room. And the high point, predictably, was outside Harrods in South Kensington. Okay, so that's not changed either. And that's a reasonable thing to do. That's a measure of quality, which we would all agree with. Rather than in brackets, I've tried to persuade my UCL students, the men to score women and the women to score men. And the prediction would be, the Darwinian prediction is, that women should be more consistent in their choices because they're the ones that choose the mates, than men. But UCL students are so politically correct that they refuse to do it, so we don't know. Okay. But Galton was strongly of the opinion that everything was in the DNA. Genius, crime, everything was in the DNA. It is easy to show that the criminal nature tends to be inherited. In other words, Galton is with Calvin. Okay. Now, that notion is still very much with us. Now, Galton was smart. He didn't just make statements. He did some experiments. These are Galton's famous criminal composites. And what he did, he went to some London prisons and he hiked out some criminals, about 30 of them in this picture here. And he did something very advanced for his day. We're talking about the 1870s now. He took 10 pictures of criminals and printed them all on the same sheet in the hope that he would see a criminal face. And he admitted, because he was an honest man, unlike many people with a social interest in genetics, that he couldn't really see much difference between criminals and non-criminals. But at least he tried. But that notion that everything is in the genes is absolutely with us to the present day. You go to any newspaper on any day, and you will find, I can guarantee you, in one of them, the statement that scientists find the gene 4. Okay? And 4 is the 4-letter word, or the 3-letter word 4, is the most dangerous word in genetics. It goes, as I say, it goes back to those ancient feelings of original sin, that you were born with the gene for this or for that. Emotional memory, short sleepers, fear in the brain, religiosity, weight gain. The last one is premature ejaculation. I don't quite know how that one manages to stay in the population. But I got about 20,000 hits for scientists find the gene 4. And it seems utterly convincing, but actually, as we all know, life is not really like that at all. Now, the reason life is not like that is that genes, DNA is just a chemical. It was once known as the boring molecule. In some senses, I think it's regained that status. It was called the boring molecule because it was chemically so simple. This is before the double helix. And nobody knew what it did. They thought it was like melanin, which is just there and sort of held things together. Okay. Well, we now know that isn't true. But it's still just a chemical. It can only do its job in a biological milieu, within the cell and what have you, and the cell and the animal or the plant itself can only respond to its genetic instructions by referring to and interacting with the environment in which it finds itself. So the notion of a gene for this or for that is really quite confounding. Galton did one really remarkable piece of work in his day, which was to draw the first ever statistical diagram. Okay, and this is Galton's famous regression, and Galton invented that word. regression, the word we all hate because it's statistics, the regression of children's height on the height of their parents. What he found was that if you looked at the height of sons compared to that of the average of their mothers and fathers, indeed there was quite a strong relationship between the two. I mean, he didn't have the mathematical, the arithmetical tools to put significance on that, but he invented the word regression, and he began to see that there were indeed similarities, real similarities, not just sort of snapshot, oh, doesn't she look like her mother kind of similarities, down the generations. Now we know, of course, that that's enormously important, and there's a whole science of quantitative genetics, as it's called, which concerns itself with the inheritance of characters like height, weight, behavior, and so on, things that you measure rather than counting. Now, Galton didn't invent the word, but as anybody who's done any genetics knows, that the statistic which is widely used in studying the biology or the genetics of height or criminality or anything you like is this wonderful measure called heritability, which is a much more subtle thing than saying this is the gene for that. Because heritability, crucially, is a ratio. It's the proportion of the total variance or the total variation of the population that's due to genetic variance, genetic variation. So if you've got a population in which individuals vary in height from some sort of abnormally short like me at 5'6" to abnormally tall at 6'6", the variance is in there. It's partly due to genes and partly due to the environment. Okay, and you can measure it in various ways. You can measure it by, as Galton did, by looking at parents and offspring. You can look at twins, identical twins who share all their genes versus non-identical twins who only share half their genes. You can look at adoptions. What happens if you adopt somebody into a family? Do they begin to resemble their non-biological parents, or do they stay like their biological parents? These are all approaches to looking at heritability, and we know a lot about it. But the crucial, absolutely central to be underlined point is that heritability depends on both gene and environment and can be altered by changing either of them. So you can increase or decrease heritability by increasing or decreasing either the genetic component or, rather more easily, the environmental component. It's kind of a St. Augustine kind of measure because, okay, you're born with rotten genes, but maybe you can improve matters by living in a decent environment. Or, alternatively, the other way. You've got good genes, but you go out and get drunk every night, and so your good genes have no chance to show themselves. So that's what heritability is. And it's clear that human height is highly heritable. We have huge, staggering amounts of data on the heritability of human height, involving many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of parents and offspring correlations. And the heritability of human height is about 0.8. So 80% of the total variation within any human population is due to genetic variation. Rather, in brackets, people have started looking now with technology for the genes behind that variation, and they're not finding them. Last time I looked, 100 or so gene loci had been found behind the variation in human height, and altogether they explained less than 5% of the total genetic variation that must be there. But that's the second question. It's what I call macavity genes. The evidence is there, but you can't find the criminals. But the central point is that human height is highly heritable. But of course, that doesn't mean to say, because of this balance between gene and environment, nature and nurture, it doesn't mean you can't change it for non-genetic reasons. And here we have the increase in mean height over 40 years or so, from 1950 to the present day, in Europeans and North and South, and you can see there's been a slow and really quite remarkable increase in height over that very, very short period, which actually has gone much further now. The Dutch are the tallest people in Europe now. On average, they're 3 inches taller than we stunted Brits, 4 inches taller than we even more stunted Welsh, okay? So it's genetic, but it's also environmental, and that's banal and understandable, but many people forget that crucial point. So, okay, how are we going to disentangle this question of nature and nurture, gene and environment? How can we do it? Well, Galton knew that there were environmental issues out there, and he became interested. He was interested in many things. So one of the things he was interested in was horse racing. Right? He did a lot of work on the heritability of horses winning races. Okay, and he he found that it was heritable to a degree, and he didn't hesitate for a moment to make an enormous intellectual leap. And he said, as it is easy to obtain by selection a breed of dogs or horses gifted with powers of running, so it would be practical to produce a highly gifted race of men, women as well presumably, by judicious marriages during consecutive generations. As we can breed horses for points, so we can breed men for points. Okay, that was the eugenics idea. And ironically enough, sport shows the tension between nature, including horse racing, the tension between nature and nurture, and the way that you can change the relative contribution of original sin versus a decent life better than almost anything else. Because many sports at the topmost level are pushing the physical limits of biological endurance in running marathons or in the derby and a horse race and the like. And under those circumstances, genes, genetic variants, which are irrelevant to lazy slobs like me, and not like you, of course, then begin to become important. And there's a great phrase, the Bible is a very odd book. It's full of quotations. It's always, you come across that phrase, you think, my God, I didn't know that was in the Bible. And there it is. One of them, very nice one is, from Ecclesiastes, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. And here are these horses battling it out, seeing which one is going to be the swiftest. But that quote continues, but time and chance happeneth to them all. In other words, here we've got some unfortunate horse has tripped at the fence, and all the other incredibly valuable thoroughbreds have fallen over it. In this particular instance, unfortunately, 2 or 3 of them were killed. It's at Aintree. And whatever their genes are for running, they're completely irrelevant because time and chance, random environmental facts have completely snookered them, and they're not going to win that race. Okay. And sport is really a beautiful little microcosm of what we understand and what we don't understand about inheritance. And it begins to raise an interesting question, which is when you can, if you can, work out who among horses or humans is biologically blessed, has very good genes for running in a race, let's say, what do you do about it? And that's an interesting question which has no consistent answer. All right, well, here's horses. Horses, of course, in many horse races, in about half of them, in fact, there's a handicapping system. And the handicapping system turns on the horse's record, its parenthood, how long it's been since the last race, and various other quite complicated measures which punters spend many hours arguing about and before they place their bets, and the bookies set the odds on this. Okay, and if a horse comes out with a very high score on this measure, it looks like a damn good horse. What do? You make it carry weights. Okay, you handicap it. You give it a penalty to make all the horses work on a metaphorically level playing field. If it's a horse that's won all its races, it has to carry 5 pounds of lead weight to give everybody a roughly equal chance, which of course is good for the bookies because then random noise comes in and the punters are much more likely to lose. All right, so we handicap them for being good. Now, because there are millions and millions of pounds involved in this is a highly skilled job. And in the last year or two, there's begun to emerge something which deeply worries the horse racing world, but has a wider interest, which is that there are particular mutations which change the ability of horses to run and succeed in particular races. They were first seen in this creature here, which is a whippet. Now, whippets are these actually rather nice dogs, which run around tracks like small versions of greyhounds. Okay, and about 15 years ago there was a mutation to what was called a bully whippet, and a bully whippet has 2 copies of a particular variant which damages a particular growth factor that's called myostatin. Myostatin's job is to stop muscles growing too big. Okay, so if you've got normal myostatin, your muscles will grow to a certain level, but they won't get enormous. Now, on the right here, you'll see a whippet that has 2 copies of myostatin, the myostatin mutant, which cannot make the myostatin, and you'll see it's enormously over-muscled. All right, this variant, incidentally, is now used in beef breeding, because you get a double-muscled animal which has got lots of meat on it, and that's all very good if you eat meat. Okay. Now, the bully whippets themselves are not raced. In fact, they're usually killed by breeders. But plenty of the heterozygotes, which look to the non-expert eye, are in the racing whippet world, and they win the races. Okay, one copy of bully means you have slightly better muscles, and so you win. But in whippetting, in the whippetting world, unlike the horse racing world, they don't handicap. They don't carry weights. So now we've got a situation where the winners depend on what genes they've carried. And it would be an utterly trivial job in the modern world of molecular genetics to find out with a little chip, pull out one hair from the whippet's tail, and you'll find out whether it's a heterozygote or not, and then you can put all your money on that animal. Okay? So this is just the beginning of what's going to turn out to be a nightmare for the betting world. And it turned out, indeed, that exactly or very similar situation happens in horses as well, because there's the myostatin in horses. There are two versions of myostatin. Not unlike in whippets, where one of them doesn't work at all. One of the variants, the T variant, which is found in almost all other horses apart from thoroughbreds, which are the things which run in the Derby and the like, and are also found in zebras. That's the ancestral variant. That's the standard. But in some thoroughbreds, they carry a mutant that's called C. Okay, just one DNA base change in the myostatin gene. And it appeared probably a couple of hundred years ago in the thoroughbred stock in a male, a female. And in the old days, they didn't used to keep records on females because females weren't important. It was just the males that mattered. So we don't know when it appeared, but it was spread in the 1950s by this remarkable horse here that's called Nearctic, Canadian horse, which had something like 400 offspring by artificial insemination, and was a very successful racer. And it's now spread throughout the thoroughbred world. Okay, and in fact, what turns out that horses with two copies of the standard T version are best suited and will win on long distance races. Horses of the new variant C, homozygotes, are much better at short distances, and heterozygotes are better at intermediate distances. And there's an Irish company that's called Equinome that will genotype your horses for you. They won't tell the public yet, but the public will find out, that's for sure. It would be easy to do. And that too, that's going to cause big problems in the horse racing world. Okay, so we now know who's born to win and who's born to lose, and that takes away a lot of the interest, perhaps, of the race through life. Now, that doesn't alter the fact that, as is the case for human height, that actually the heritability of speed and distance depends on circumstances. The heritability of speed in thoroughbreds, based on family studies, is about 0.4. On dry tracks, 40% of the variation in speed is due to genetic variation. But on wet tracks, where they can fall over and break their necks much more easily, or slip and go slow, the heritability is only about 0.2. Now, remarkably enough, we get exactly the same story in human sport. Here we have the only child that we know of that's got double copies of the myostatin mutation. It's a German young lad. We don't know anything more about him. His mother was a champion athlete. His father presumably must have been heterozygote too. He's got two copies of myostatin deficiency and is very muscular. Okay. Well, that's myostatin. We don't actually, for myostatin itself in humans, have much variation, but we have plenty of variation in other genes which alter athletic ability. Most of all, this famous gene here, ACE, which you probably have heard of, the angiotensin converting enzyme. That's actually the It's variable. It involves the degree to which blood vessels tighten up when the body, or relax when the body is under stress, such as very low levels of oxygen. And it's widely used in medicine. It was worked on by a colleague of mine, Hugh Montgomery, who's a trauma surgeon, and by definition is hence a psychopath, as all trauma surgeons are. And it turned out that if you had your chest crushed in an accident and you're hovering on the edge of death, it makes a big difference what your genotype for the ACE polymorphism is, okay? Because one variant, and we'll look at it in a moment, is very bad at soaking up oxygen, and one variant is very good. And the variants turn on a deletion in one of the functional parts of the gene. Some people have got two versions of what we call the inserted version, the I version of the ACE locus, ACE protein. Some people have two versions of the deleted version, the D version, in which a great length of it has long ago has been taken out. And some people are heterozygotes. And that alters the amount of the angiotensin you've got. Now, Hugh Montgomery, who's a remarkable guy, really, is one of his many hobbies. He has several hobbies. Deep diving by holding his breath is one of them. The other one is climbing Everest without oxygen. And he's worked for many years to try and climb Everest and the Himalayas without oxygen. And he began to look at this, and we have a big camp on Everest Base Camp now, which is populated by medics every year, looking at people with low oxygen, under low oxygen stress. And it turns out that actually, if you've got two copies of the inserted version, the long version, you are much, much better at dealing with low levels of oxygen. So the people who've climbed Everest without oxygen, the vast majority of them are II homozygotes. Nobody who's climbed Everest without oxygen is a DD homozygous. And ironically enough, Hugh Montgomery himself has two copies of that blue DD variant, which means he will never ever be able to climb Everest without oxygen, and he's given up. It's also the case, if you look at training ability, it turns out if you're training for a distance event, like a marathon, you do much better, your improvement is much greater if you're II than if you're ID. Now, in fact, that is only one of many different genes supposed to affect human sporting ability, which are variable, and you can put together a kind of agenda of what particular combination of genes you've got. And here's some work which has been done in Spain quite recently, last year in fact, where they look at the distribution of this mix of alleles in the general population in blue, and in the athletic endurance athletic population in Spain, and there's a big difference. So in principle, you could find out before you enter the marathon who's going to win and who isn't. Okay, now what are we going to do about that? We don't make people who have very good combinations of genes carry lead weights. It would make no sense to have Mo Farah carry a crate of pale ale every time he ran a race in order to slow him down. We think that was balmy, but in the world of horse racing, they do. So here already we're beginning to be rather inconsistent in the way in which we do it. Now, the way in which, and these genes are most important at the extremes of ability. Now, I'm sure for most of us, and there'll be II and ID and DD ACE gene people in this room, that's for sure. It's quite irrelevant unless you decide to run a marathon, to go to Olympic gold in some sport or other, or decide to be run over by a bus and have your chest crushed, and in those environments this gene becomes absolutely crucial. To show the importance of the environment, even in a situation where genes clearly play a part, here's this chap. You recognize one of them, who is Mo Farah. It turns out that Mo Farah has an identical twin. And Mo Farah fled Somalia when he was a young lad with his father to get away because his father was being threatened by the various thugs who lived there. Came to Britain, became British, went to a British state school. His athletic ability was picked up very early, and he was given intensive training to turn him into the master athlete he now is. His twin brother stayed with his mother in Somalia, and he's a car mechanic with no athletic ability at all. So before you start spinning the gene story, let's remember the environment is pretty important too. There's a good illustration. People want to believe that his athletic ability is in the genes. I went, and many others are in the genes too. I went a couple of years ago to a talk by the pianist Daniel Barenboim, who is an absolutely fantastically wonderful pianist, and he was being interviewed by Sue Lawley, and Sue Lawley asked him, have you ever met any other people who, like you, were a childhood prodigy? Because Barenboim was a master pianist at the age of 5. And Barenboim came up with a really great answer. He said, "Oh, no, I never met anybody like that. I've met plenty of their parents." In other words, the parents want to believe that their children are prodigies, but they ain't. It's easy to fool yourself. So sport, okay, sport. It's not that important. I have zero interest in sport. But there are other and perhaps deeper issues which there's tension about what you do when you know about genetic differences. What do you do about it? Now, when I was 11 years old, some years ago, I underwent a genetic test. And that was in 1955, which is pretty impressive given that the double helix was only discovered in 1953. But actually, the people who were giving the test didn't know they were doing genetics, but the people who designed it sure as hell did, because I sat the 11 plus examination. This is the examination now in most places, thank God, gone away, where you sat an exam, and if you passed it, you went to a grammar school and you had a decent life, and if you failed it, your life was actually really very badly damaged. As it happened, my brother failed it and I passed. He became a bricklayer, I became a professor, so obviously failing it was a good idea. But it really was a major moment in anybody's life. And it turned on the 1944 Education Act, which had a strongly Galtonian feel behind it. The feeling was that there existed in Britain a large pool of talented young people who were not getting the education that they deserved. And if we could pick them out and give them a superior education, not handicap them, actually give them a great deal of advantage by sending them to a grammar school, then the country, the nation, would actually gain from it. And the tests were actually quite difficult. Here's an absolutely typical one. You had to do them very quickly. You had to fill in the bottom right square. What should it look like? And I'll leave it to your, no doubt, enormous intelligences to work it out. But when you're, 11 years old and you know this is the most important day in your life, which it is, it was, it becomes quite tense. Another one, here are, in each question below, find the two words that are different from the others. Well, if you think about it for 5 minutes, you can work it out. But if you've got 20 seconds to do it in, it's not too easy, particularly if you're just an ordinary working class person who probably had never heard a word like ridicule before. Okay. But anyway, that lasted for many years in some counties such as Kent. It's still there, unfortunately, and it was very, very important. When I did my A-levels, which of course were the key to university and entrance, about 7 years after passing the 11 plus and going to Whittle Grammar School, not more than 1 in 1,000 students who'd failed the 11 plus did any A-levels, and none among the millions of kids who failed the 11 plus, not one of them got into either Oxford or Cambridge. So it was a big, big deal. Okay, so that's an interesting observation. It turns on the assumption that there is a genetic basis behind variation in IQ, and there is. I mean, for many years, as of course you know, this was politically a very incorrect thing to say, particularly as various idiots, American idiots, claimed that it was a difference in IQ score between blacks and whites was genetic, and you shouldn't waste any more money on black education. And that was an outrageously stupid thing to say. But that doesn't alter the fact that you could look for the heritability of IQ, and you can certainly find IQ to be heritable. And let's remind ourselves again what that actually means. Well, it is heritable, but that doesn't alter the fact, needless to say, that it can respond to the environment. And just as is the case for human height, mean IQ has gone up quite strikingly over the last 40 or 50 years. It's called the Flynn effect. The average mean IQ of an English boy or girl in 1918 on a modern score would have been about 70, all right, which we would count as being mentally subnormal. All right? So the IQ average has gone up rapidly, not for any genetic reasons, but for reasons we simply don't understand: better education, better food, that kind of stuff. Okay. Interestingly enough, this Flynn effect diagram, which is much talked about, runs out about 1992. If you look at the most recent stuff, the Flynn effect seems to have flattened off a bit. So IQ is not increasing at the rate it did, but certainly over that period, it rose really quite strikingly. So, how do we respond to the fact that there is a heritability of IQ? The 1944 Education Act responded by saying we must find the genetic component of IQ and reward those who've got a good gene. Okay, it would make equal intellectual sense to handicap them and say, "Oh, you're pretty smart, so bugger off and look after yourself, mate. We'll put all the money into these poor people without any good genes." But they didn't do that. This is, after all, Britain, not Sweden. Okay, so what do? They looked at the genetic component of it, and they assumed that it was, as it was heritable, you could pick out people with good genes and reward them. But that again was very strongly a failure of understanding of the word, what heritability means, because it turns out that there are huge studies of the heritability of IQ based on twin studies, adoptions, and that kind of stuff. And here's a huge study from the United States: the heritability of IQ in relation to age. Okay, from the age of 8 to 10, the heritability of IQ is only 0.1, so only a tenth of the variation in IQ is due to genetic variation. From the age of 18 to 21, it's about 0.4, so 40% is due to genetic variation. At the age of 70, it goes up to 0.7, and that's very common in heritability studies. Heritability in children is low, and you can see that with adoption studies, where if you adopt children into a family at a young age, their IQ and their score and their behavior very quickly converges onto that of the children, the biological children of the parents who have adopted you. They rapidly converge onto that score. Okay, and what this tells you, of course, that the 11 plus was a complete fiasco. There was no heritability of IQ at the age of 11. They weren't picking out good genes. They were picking out lucky children. All right, and you can see how much they were picking out lucky children if you ask about the heritability of IQ in relation to family income. And if you're in the bottom 10th in the US, you are poor, and you are quite likely to be a single mother living in a slum of a very poor environment, and the heritability of IQ in those families is almost zero. Everybody is dragged down to the same low level. The top 10%, you're going to be rich, and the heritability of IQ is much higher. So the influence of genes depends on the environment. Poverty drags people down, whatever their genes. A decent playing field allows genetic variation to manifest itself. There's a very recent piece of work which I just came across the other day, which is slightly hard to interpret, but it's pretty damn clever. This is a huge survey done at King's College London, of heritability based on twin studies in different parts of Britain. Okay, and the warmer the colour, the higher the attribute. And if you look at the right there, that's a map of income inequality in different parts of Britain. And you can see that the hotspot of inequality, as of course we know, is in London and the southeast of England, where there's lots of filthy rich people and a great number of extremely poor people. Elsewhere in Britain, things are a little bit more equal. And if you look on the left, that's the environmental component of heritability, okay? The amount to which genetics is not important. And you'll see that the importance of genetics goes down dramatically in places where there's a lot of inequality. So what we've got, again, we have a very rough playing field, inequality, lots of environmental differences, the importance of genes goes away. So if everybody went to the school, to Whittle Grammar School, the one I went to, or for that matter to Eton, then the genetic component would be much stronger. But because people go to places, schools of different quality, genetics becomes much less important. Okay, so again, that's a statement of the ambiguous nature of heritability. Let's turn finally to Galton's great concern, which was the inheritance of aberrant and criminal behavior. Okay? Now, again, he himself felt strongly that crime ran in families. Well, clearly, crime does run in families. The strongest predictor that a young lad will go to prison is that his father went to prison. Okay, so it's heritable, no question of that at all. So there's a heritability in there. Some people have tried to pin that down, with some success, I have to say, to particular genes. And this is the famous example of it, which many of you may have heard of. It's a gene called monoamine oxidase. The monoamine oxidase does many things, but it's involved among other tasks in the transmission of nerve impulses across synapses. Okay, I won't go into the biochemistry of what it does, but it's involved in serotonin, the kind of the happiness hormone, kind of. All right, and it's variable, just like the bully Whippets, just like the muscle hormone, myostatin, very occasionally people are born with no activity of monoamine oxidase. Okay, let me show you. Some people are born with low activities of monoamine oxidase, and what you can do, this is what we call molecular phrenology. Okay, you can scan people's brains and show them a picture of a terrified face, and a little bit at the bottom of the brain, the primitive so-called part of the brain, lights up. It's called the amygdala, and so you show them a picture of somebody screaming in terror, and the amygdala lights up. And you can quantify that, and you can ask what's the relationship between that horrified response to an angry or a frightened face and the activity of the enzyme. And let's just look on the left at people with low MAO activity. It turns out if you've got low MAO activity, let's look at the males, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Low monoamine oxidase activity, which as it happens, I have very low monoamine oxidase activity, so try not to alarm me with your questions. You're much more likely to have a rapid brain response to this frightened, terrified, or angry, or aggressive face. So that's a bit of a curiosity, or so it seemed. But about 15 years ago, a Dutch family turned up which didn't just have low monoamine oxidase activity, it had no monoamine oxidase activity. And the story turns on an acquaintance of mine called Han Brunner, who worked as a geneticist in the hospital in Nijmegen in Holland. And a young woman came to him one day to his counselling clinic, and she said she was getting married and she wanted to have children, but she wanted to be offered the chance of a pregnancy termination if it was found that any fetus of hers was male rather than female. Now I can tell you for certain in Holland and here, that's not allowable, definitely not allowable. There has to be a medical reason for it. So she was very insistent, and Hambrunner sort of asked her, well, why didn't she want a son? And rather reluctantly, she showed him a family tree of her immediate family. And it turned out that many of her male relatives had got into terrible trouble with the law for crimes ranging from arson to beating up policemen, to fighting in the street, to stabbing people and that kind of stuff. And she'd drawn a family tree. And it was much more manifest, this particular situation, in males than in females. And as of course you all know as biologists, this is a classic sex-linked character. What we've got is women can carry the damaged gene, but they don't manifest its effects because they've got a matching X chromosome. Men with a single X carry the damaged gene and show its effect. All those men shown in red had got into trouble in the law, and if you looked at their DNA, it turned out there was one DNA change which cut off the monoamine oxidase gene. Okay, so here we've got the gene for crime. There's no question of that. This is a gene, if you've got it, you will get into terrible trouble with the law. Well, that caused a lot of uproar and amazement. But once again, let me just I told you I'd never given this talk before, I'm thinking on my feet. That caused a lot of uproar and amazement, but once again, you get into the situation where nature and nurture are working together. There was a paper published very recently from New Zealand, which looked at kids with low MAO activity who lived in different kinds of circumstances. Some of them lived in happy households and they were pretty much okay. They got into mild trouble. Some of them lived in very stressful, unhappy, poor households. And it turned out that once again there was an almost diagrammatic fit between the response to the environment and the gene in which you found yourself. The rate of violent offending went up to about 75% in kids from a very damaged family with, absent father, drunkenness, that kind of stuff, and low monoamine oxidase activity. It went up by about 20 times compared to kids who come from who have low monoamine oxidase activity, who come from happy families. But if you've got high monoamine oxidase activity and you come from a difficult family, it goes up by 3 or 4 times, but not as much. So nature and nurture are working together. So it's worth emphasizing that fact, because now we begin to get away from the biology of the issue to the actual how are we going to use this information. This is the question that actually so much concerned the theologians of long ago. People don't like the idea that particular human attributes are under the control of genes, and that we should change our attitude to those who have and do not have particular genetic variants. But we've been doing it for years, okay? We're completely familiar with the idea that all kinds of human attributes are under simple genetic control that differs from one individual to the next. It turns on another hormone, this stuff here, testosterone, which of course men have and women have very much less of, okay? And testosterone is pretty damned dangerous and powerful stuff. I sometimes think of the male-female differences as being Mendels' elephant. Mendels' elephant has been in the room for so long, we know there are big differences in all kinds of ways between men and women, that we forget that it's there, okay? But it's there, and it has big effects. For example, let's go back to sport. There is one gene that makes a huge difference to sporting ability, and it is the testosterone gene, okay? Men and women usually compete in separate events, but if they don't, in the marathon, for example, most men are on average 10% faster than women. These are the finishing times for men compared in blue compared to women in purple, and you can see the men finish quicker. What do? We don't make the men carry crates of pale ale. They win the marathon. In fact, there's a male winner and a female winner. And that's a genetic phenomenon. You cannot deny that fact. Training is important, and the best women are far better than the vast majority of men. But even so, there is that very real difference. And in some sports it's even greater. And of course, sport is rather trivial, but when you get to more important differences in behavior, we get just the same thing. Here's the murder rate by men and by women in terms of age in England and Wales. And you'll see that we charming bearers of all that testosterone murder at about 10 times the rate that women do, okay? That murder rate is highest when we're trying to prove what wonderful husbands we'd make, when we're about your age, at about 20 or so, 20 to 30, when male competition is at its greatest, okay? There are some grumpy old men, I know just how they feel like at the end there, but men, English men murder at 10 times the rate of English women. And that's pretty universal. If you go to the city of Detroit in the US, we get exactly the same pattern, 10 times the difference in murder rate, okay? So you might say, oh, there's the gene for crime, it's on the Y chromosome. Well, yes, it is. I don't deny that for a moment, okay? But let's just for a moment look at it a bit more carefully. The murder rate in Detroit per million goes up to about 1,000 per million. The murder rate in England and Wales goes up to 25 per million, okay? So that huge difference of 40 times in the murder rate is entirely due to the environment, the presence of guns, gangs, drugs, despair. But males who carry this gene are actually much more liable to be damaged by that environment. So it's a nature-nurture interaction. What do we do about it? Okay. Do you say to a man who's murdered somebody, do you say, oh, okay, mate, you're right, it's not your fault, you didn't do it, the Y chromosome did it? No, it doesn't work like that, I'm afraid. If you look at the sentencing policy, there are big differences in sentencing policy between men and women. We have in this country, thank God, we do not anymore have the death penalty. Some of you may have heard of Ruth Ellis, who shot her lover in the Magdala pub in Hampstead and was hanged, the last woman hanged in Britain in 1955, okay? Many people my age will have remember Ruth Ellis quite well, and she's much talked about. How many people have heard of Peter Allen and Gwyn Evans, who were the last two men to be hanged in Britain in 1964? That's when I was an undergraduate, okay? They're forgotten because the idea of hanging a woman was so shocking that it stayed in our minds. And that still goes on. Here are a recent survey done by the British Home Office. It's not easy to do because men are criminals, okay? Women criminals. Women who commit crimes with victims are very, very rare. They might shoplift and things, but they don't beat people up very much. But you can match them for offences. And it turns out, indeed, that for every single offence, men are penalised because of the genes they carry. Okay? That gene, which does so many wonderful things and makes you male, you pay a heavy penalty for carrying it if you carry out an offence. Now, that's odd because there are other genetic conditions, let's say schizophrenia, where exactly the opposite is applied. Criteria are applied. If you beat somebody up or you kill somebody, you push them in front of a tube train and you're arrested, And you say, with every appearance of honesty, that you did it because the devil was speaking in your ear and told you you had to do it, you're quite likely to have schizophrenia, which has a strong inherited component. The courts will then treat you differently and possibly more leniently than somebody who says, well, I didn't like his bloody face, so I pushed him in front of the train, okay? So having that gene makes the courts treat you better. Having a Y chromosome gene makes them treat you worse. Now, this whole issue goes very deep. I was involved marginally in a court case in Georgia, in the States 10, 15 years ago now, with this chap here, Stephan Mobley, okay? And Stephan Mobley was a murderer. He'd shot at least 5 people in cold blood. He used to rob Domino pizza stores and take the money and then just kill the guy behind the counter. And he was a completely awful person. And when he was arrested, he had himself covered in domino tattoos and it would eat nothing but pizza. All right. Now, this was the time when the death penalty was coming back into the United States. Well, it unfortunately has now re-established itself. And in Georgia, there were 2-stage trials, guilty or not guilty, and then a second trial, death penalty or not death penalty. He was obviously guilty, no question of that. The evidence was overwhelming. So it went to the second trial. And this was the time, 95, was it, 94, when Han Brunner's paper on the Dutch family appeared. And his lawyer, I was in the States at the time, and his lawyers were ringing around, they rang me up. And they said, did I know anything about this paper? I said, yes, he did. And would I come and see them, talk to them? So I did. God, they were weird. They would only discuss science in a lap dancing club. I couldn't believe it. It was nightmarish. But we had a long talk, and I've always been passionately opposed, still am, to the death penalty. And the lawyers decided, okay, what we'll do is we'll demand that Stephan Mobley be tested for this gene. And if he's got this MAOA totally deficiency gene, then he can't be blamed for his actions, and he should not be executed. Now, that seems, the logic of that perhaps seems clear to us, nice liberal people, but it went on for years. It's clear he couldn't possibly have had that Dutch gene. It's never ever been found anywhere else. But he managed to stay out of the execution chamber for about 6 years by using this argument. But in the end, he was killed. When was it? He was killed in 2005, executed in 2005. Okay. And he wanted to use a genetic defense that he was genetically damaged and hence should be forgiven to some degree. Okay. Now, I think most people would see the logic of that. That caused a great uproar in the States when he tried that. And the state of Texas, which was then governed by a chap, I'm not sure what became of him, a guy called George W. Bush, the state of Texas then changed its execution status. And of course, Texas is the big killing state in the US. It carries out almost half the executions in the United States now. It changed the rules. It said that in the statute, it then said, anyone who is held to be a continuing threat to society will be liable to the death penalty. In other words, if you say, I have a gene that made me violent, you'll go straight to the electric chair. Now, that's an interesting contrast to what we saw Mobley trying to do. But it's exactly the same contrast we see in the world of horse racing, of sport, of education. It's easy to identify genes which alter behavior and alter your mental and physical attributes. It's much more difficult to decide what to do about it. And it's clear we've reached a point in the argument where you don't need advice from a geneticist, but from a theologian. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Is it going to be in the exam? That's the one I always get after my UC.
If not, then we invite all BioSoc and Scientific Society members to come to the drinks reception afterwards. I'd also like to remind members that there is a talk on Thursday for BioSoc with Lord Krebs in Jesus at 5:30. And isn't there a scientific society?
Yeah, so next week we're very lucky to have Eurosceptic, a prolific neuroscience blogger amongst their public appearances speak here. There'll also be a dinner beforehand. So it's all scientific society members and we will go out over the weekend.
And just to finish off, we would like to say a massive thank you to Professor Jones for making evolution a lot more relevant to today's society. I think there was a question.
Yeah, I think we
Yeah.
can manage a few questions.
Yeah, no, I think we probably should, yeah.
Regarding about the nature-nurture debate and the various people from theologians that you talked about, I was wondering if the nature part of it is quite so identifiable just with genes, and whether having the genes and everything's due to the genes, whether that's entirely identifiable with determinism and Calvinism.
Yeah, I simplify, right? But there are parallels between the two, there's no question, they don't overlap. The interesting thing is there's been a great shift in the world of genetics in the last 3 or 4 years. 7 or 8 years ago was the time of the GWAS, the beginning of the GWAS era, Genome-Wide Association Studies, as they were called. And there was a strong feeling, because we had discovered so much about simple genes like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, sickle cell disease, there was a strong feeling that as technology advanced, one would find common genes for common diseases, okay? So that heart disease, let's say, would be, if you screened a lot of people who had heart disease, a lot of people who didn't, you would find 1 or 2 genes that were different between the heart disease group and the non-heart disease group, okay? So it was a strongly deterministic view. But in fact, that didn't happen at all. At all. In schizophrenia, which has a high heritability in family terms, there are no genes at all have been found. Okay? We know it's heritable, but we haven't found any genes which are seriously ascribable to causing the symptoms. But I think, it's a mistake to argue, as perhaps I did, that you can take the phenotype of crime or schizophrenia or happiness or premature ejaculation, whatever you like, and take it as a kind of cake. You can slice into a bit that's called nature and a bit called nurture. You can't do that. It's always intermingled. But that doesn't alter the fact that behind every attribute there is some nature left. And I'm interested in changing my attitude, actually, particularly in the genetics of IQ. Now, when I was a student and afterwards, this was the beginning of the Herrnstein and Murray era. These are the people who wrote the bell curve, who were a nasty duo. One of them is dead, I'm glad to say. They were a very unpleasant duo. It's an extreme American political right. They were strongly of the opinion there was no point in educating blacks because they were stupid. The whole thing was outrageous. And everybody in the world of genetics just blew up against them. But life isn't like that. You've got to look at the data. If it were the case, that it was the case, that blacks all had genes that made them irredeemably stupid, what would you do about it? You could either give them a huge amount better education to bring them up, or you could push them down, which of course what actually happened, on the argument that they couldn't benefit from it. So geneticists, biologists and left-wing scientists, most of us I guess, were totally resistant to the idea that there was any heritability in any genes behind IQ. And that was just stupid, because there's genes behind everything. And now that's stopped, and people are now looking for the genes behind variation in IQ. They're not finding them within the normal range. At the very low range, yes, of course you find them. But I think it's now just another phenotype. And it's no longer as heavily politicized as it used to be. And that's a move forward. And it's the same with male-female differences. There was a time, and maybe some people in this room still feel this, that you should not talk about inborn differences in the behavior of men and women. But they're there. Men are the murderers. Women get into university more than men do. All this has got something to do with genetics. And I think as long as you understand the limits of genetics, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to look at.
There's going to be some grey area between the environment.
Well, I think everything's, it's 50 shades of grey, isn't it? I mean, everything is grey. Some things are black. Yeah, I think everything is grey. Any other questions? Lady at the back.
I guess on that point of where you draw the line between nature and nurture, with what we know now about epigenetic changes and things like that, and obviously the environment changes your actual physiology and the structure of your brain with everything you experience. What then becomes you know, if you start off with certain genes, but you're in a certain environment, then you have changes that might be within the rest of your life, even if you change the environment. So is that then,
Yeah,
you know,
I think that.
within nature?
I think that's true. I mean, the next great morass of confusion into which genetics is going to fall is called epigenetics, all right? And I'm sure we're going to end up completely drowning in fooling ourselves as to what's going on. But epigenetics is, you know, I was actually taught genetics by the guy who invented the word epigenetics, a guy called C.H. Waddington. And in Edinburgh in 1966, they opened a building on the horrible science campus called the Epigenetics Building. And I have vivid memories of standing there and saying to the bloke next to me, what's this epigenetics then? He said, well, I don't really know. And then they'd ask somebody else, go, well, I don't really know what it is. Actually, it's something about how you get from DNA to being a human being. And I think it's still in that state, really. We don't know much more than that. We know a lot about methylation and that kind of stuff, but its general importance, I think, is very far from being clear. And I don't think it'll make, I may be wrong, I don't think it'll make a big difference to the heritability story, but I may be wrong. No doubt the people in this room will, 5 years from now, when you finish your PhDs, will prove how wrong I've been.
Sorry, I was just going to ask on that, where do you think society is going to take this ethically, in the sense that as we learn more and more of how there are genetic bases for this, or that I guess all of your behaviour, when it comes down to it, is really a product of maybe like circumstances beyond your control. You know, the question, do we have free will? Like, what does that mean? Does it exist? Do you think society?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a theological question. I mean, genetics, you know, human genetics, is really unique among sciences because almost all the questions it asks are politically and religiously loaded. You know, things like prenatal termination of pregnancy, which to somebody like me, if you've got a child with cystic fibrosis, it seems to me absolutely acceptable to terminate a pregnancy. But to many people, it's totally unacceptable. And I don't think, and I don't have any sympathy with that view, but I can see where they're coming from. But I don't think science adds much to the argument, except to point out that if the child is born with cystic fibrosis or something even worse, it's going to have a very, very miserable and shortened life. Now, if people know the facts of science, they have to make up their own political and religious minds about what to do with it. You know, knowledge makes you free. I think as long as people know the facts, I don't think science can actually do very much to change the way in which they interpret them. But what I found interesting about writing this talk, which I did yesterday, is the amazing inconsistency we see in our own interpretation of what are basically the same scientific facts when they're applied to crime or to sport or to education. We're just inconsistent. Whether there's a consistent answer, I don't know.
Are there any more questions? Well, just to reiterate that you're more than welcome to come to the drinks evening afterwards if you're a member, and lastly to say thank you to Professor Jones for coming all this way tonight. So thanks very much.